Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this inaugural session of our ECFR Asia Programme, India-China Luncheon lecture, dedicated today to the future of India-China relations. My name is Federica, and I will be moderating this session. As indicated in our invitation, this new webinar series will feature one prominent Indian speaker a month to shed light on the various aspects of the Sino-Indian relationship and help to understand what the implications are for Europe's growing engagement with the Indo-Pacific. A year after the deadly border clashes between Indian and Chinese troops in the Himalayas, we thought it would be important to examine not only where the India-China relations are headed, but what it means to be the neighbor of an increasingly mighty, assertive, and hostile power. We believe, of course, there is value not only in a better and deeper understanding of India's foreign policy per se, but we also believe that this value lies in the perspective of the examination of the specific India-China dynamic bring to Europe at a time when individually and collectively, most European countries are in search of their own posture vis-à-vis China. To address this issue, we could dream of no better speaker than Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Ambassador Menon, you need no introduction. You have been India's national security advisor. You served as India's foreign secretary and have been ambassador to China as well as to Sri Lanka. In fact, you have held many important positions within the Indian administration. But also today, we also welcome the academic and author of India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which was recently published by Brookings Institutional Press, and which I strongly recommend to anybody who hasn't read it yet. So we thought nobody would be more qualified than you are to address the relationship of which you know all the intricacy, both as an actor and as a thinker. So with no further delay, I will hand over the floor to you for about 25 minutes before we start a discussion with the audience. And I remind everybody that you can ask questions by writing them in the Q&A box slightly below the screen. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for asking me to speak here at the first such webinar. It's a real honor and a privilege. I was asked to speak on the future of India-China relations, and the honest answer would give you a very short talk because I wish I knew what the future is. But since no one seems to know, I think, let me share some thoughts with you on where I think the relationship is, because I believe it's in crisis, and where I think that relationship might be going and what it means for not just India and China, but for the region, for Asia, and maybe a little bit about the rest of the world. India-China relations, as you said, are in crisis since 2020, when the PLA prevented Indian soldiers from patrolling in areas which they had patrolled for years before and using those routes. And on June 20th last year, actually 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 Chinese soldiers were killed in a clash at Galwan, the first such deaths on the border since 1975. And so 2020 marked a phase transformation in the relationship. The relationship has always been uneasy, but the modus vivendi worked out in the 80s had actually kept the peace and kept the border where it was, basically unchanged, for almost 3 decades. And during that time, both sides had discussed the boundary and political divisions, kept the border peaceful, allowed trade and other functional relationships to flourish, and cooperated in the international stage where their interests coincided. But this began to change after 2012, increasing PLA assertiveness on the border, resulting in an escalating series of face-offs, confrontations, starting with Depsang in 2013, Chuma 2014, Doklam 2017, and so on. As a result of the Chinese trying to change the status quo in several points along the border and the confrontation, by August 2020, 91% of Indians said they wouldn't buy any Chinese products, and about 84% of Indians believe that Xi Jinping had betrayed Prime Minister Modi. And especially because Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping had met something like 18 times in the 6 years before that. And by the end of the year, 100,000 troops from both sides confronted each other over the winter of 2021 in really punishing conditions in high altitude desert. And that build-up and confrontation still continues in several areas, with the exception of the Pangong Tso area, where some disengagement took place in February. Today, basically, the entire LAC is live, the line of actual control. And Chinese actions have called into question the various military confidence building measures and operating procedures under successive agreements, starting with the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 1993, which were designed to prevent precisely what the PLA did in 2020. And the Chinese have effectively reopened the issue of peace on the borders. Why did the Chinese do this? I mean, many people offer sort of military tactical reasons. India was playing catch up in terms of border infrastructure. The Chinese wanted to stop that. They wanted to maintain the present situation. India changed the status of Jammu and Kashmir in 2019 into 2 union territories administered from the center, or it was a Chinese attempt to straighten the LAC. But none of these actually explain the timing, the scale, and the nature of the Chinese action, which had obvious strategic consequences and must therefore have been approved at the highest level. For years, as China's relationship with the US deteriorated, and at least for about 3 years or so now, Chinese commentators have stressed that India is no longer non-aligned, which I suppose is code for saying it's no longer neutral between China and the US. And the Chinese watched with concern as India concluded military agreements permitting interoperability between Indian and US armed forces, particularly the navies. They see Indian participation in the revived Quad, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, as making India part of the maritime containment of China by the US. So it's possible that, and I'm speculating here, if Chinese leaders were convinced that India had already gone over to the dark side, chosen the wrong side, the spring 2020 Chinese actions were probably meant to convey a set of messages, a warning shot across the bow for India, as a message to India that the US was no answer to India's issues with China, as a signal to the US that India is not a reliable or useful counterweight to China, and equally coming at a time when China is much more actively engaged in South Asian politics and economies, including the internal politics of Nepal, Sri Lanka, and so on. China probably intended to show other countries that they, like Bhutan, that they should deal directly with China rather than rely on India for their security. If these were indeed the Chinese goals, either the tactical military ones or the broader strategic ones I've mentioned, Xi has yet to achieve them. And it's, if anything, her actions have successfully pushed and solidified the India-US partnership that she is so allergic to. And it's too early today, actually, to say how this crisis created on the LAC, but now extending into a broader crisis in the relationship, how that will now be resolved. The government of India has made it clear that peace and tranquility on the border is an essential condition for India-China relations to move forward. And India's declared goal is a disengagement of forces and the restoration of the status quo all along the LAC. China, on the other hand, argues that these are all local issues. There is more to India-China relations than the boundary, that we should leave border issues to be settled by the militaries. They can discuss them and solve them while we get on with the rest of the relationship. In other words, they suggest that India accept the changed status quo that China tried to create in 2020. which frankly, to my mind, suggests an inadequate Chinese understanding of both Indian opinion and how politics works in India. Uh, there is no way that a government in Delhi can act as if nothing happened, because it would leave them hostage to subsequent Chinese behavior. The government of India's problem on the border is that if it adopts a defensive strategy of trying to defend a long line all along the LAC, its armed forces must be stronger than the opponent at every point along that perimeter. This is virtually impossible. The opponent, on the other hand, only has to be strong at those points where he seeks change. So India, therefore, is impelled to an offensive defense of riposte, as it adopted in August, September 2020, moving forward to occupy some heights south of Pangong, where China had moved forward. And Indian troops then occupied some heights in the Kailash range. The larger point is that the entire LAC is now live. And India, therefore, now has not much choice but to undertake a whole set of self-strengthening measures that ensure Indian capability and attempt to restore deterrence on the line, which obviously broke down in 2020. That already includes significant reform of military structures. We've appointed a chief of defense staff with theaterization, jointness among the services, and a matching reform of doctrine ideas. And these are designed, other steps also are designed to ensure that the effective balance of power on the LAC does not tempt China to attempt what she has done successfully in the South China Sea, the sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward strategy, which has gradually changed the status quo. So when you look at India-China relations overall today, they present a really unprecedented and confused picture because they are in political and military crisis. But at the same time, the economic relationship continues and the momentum of trade continues. India's dependence on China in terms of imports, technology, investment has grown over time in fintech, pharmaceuticals, where 66% of the precursors, APIs, come from China, auto parts, electronics components, telecom, power equipment, and so on. China accounts for over 50% of Indian imports and about 86 tariff lines. And while this was going on, in 2020, China regained her position as India's largest trading partner. And 2021, the first half, has seen records set in trading levels and a slight diminution in the trade imbalance, which is very much against India. So what's going to happen in the future? There are those who see what happened as having been caused by structural reasons. They point to India-China mutual incomprehension, derogatory perspectives of each other since the 19th century, conflict of interests on the border, in the periphery, which we share, including Tibet, differing choice of partners in international politics, growing power asymmetry, and so on. But this goes some way to explaining why India-China relations are in a crisis. But it doesn't explain the ebb and flow of why were there decades of relative peace before 2020. Nor does it explain why all this happened on the border rather than choosing other ways of achieving their objectives. Be that as it may, these structural causes of trouble in the relationship are likely to continue to operate in the foreseeable future, limiting the space available to Indian and Chinese policymakers. And there are, of course, theoretically 3 ways forward. One would be to negotiate a new strategic framework based on today's realities, as we did in the 80s, which kept the peace for about 30 years almost. But today's situation differs in terms of the relative balance of power, the correlation of forces, etc. And there's no sign, so far at least, of the kind of strategic conversations that would be required for the 2 countries to come to a new strategic understanding to guide the relationship. nor does it seem likely, frankly, that authoritarian leaders who base their legitimacy on an appeal to assertive nationalism will find it easy to make the difficult compromises required to arrive at a new strategic framework. The other extreme, of course, would be for the relations to slide into conflict, as they did in 59-62, when they were driven by an aroused public opinion and media in India and by Mao's domestic political agenda of regaining power within the CCP and holding on to a Tibetan full-fledged revolt. In 2020, however, both governments are signaling that they do not want to arouse public passions, with the exceptions, of course. Global Times is always an exception. But apart from that, what the governments are signaling, at least, that they don't want to go beyond confrontation into actual conflict, which leaves the third, and to my mind, the most likely path forward, which is a continuation of this no war, no peace situation that prevails today between the two countries on the border. For the last year, troops have been in very close proximity. India has also taken certain other actions, restricting the use of Chinese apps in India, limiting Chinese investment in India, and excluding Chinese firms, Huawei, ZTE, from the 5G bidding, by the bidding for the 5G networks in India. And I would expect to see a determined Indian effort to reduce dependencies on the Chinese economy, building alternative supply chains, resiliency, redundancy, all of which creates an opportunity actually for Europe. But probably gaining speed after the immediate recovery from the COVID-induced slowdown that we are in right now. What about the external variables affecting the relationship? The external context, the international context has actually deteriorated in a sense. COVID, I think, has affected all countries' economic prospects, turned them inwards, created internal political stress, and has sharpened all the geopolitical fractures, China, US, of course, but also others. And governments under internal pressure are hardly likely to be successful in dealing with such major issues. As China's ambitions for Asia are increasingly stridently expressed, political frictions on the periphery, in which we share, are heightened, actually. We've seen since 2015 an increasing Chinese commitment to Pakistan, not just $62 billion for the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but creating a Chinese stake in Pakistan's continued occupation of Indian territory in Kashmir. And I expect China's compulsions, because she now has other compulsions as well, Afghanistan for one, but the unsettled situation in Xinjiang, access to the Arabian Sea through Gwadar port, to lead China to double down on her commitment to Pakistan. And it will feed further stress in India-China relations, but stress in India-China relations will also feed the China-Pakistan relationship. As China-US relations seem headed for a longish period of strategic competition and some economic decoupling in technology and finance, but cooperation in other respects, that factor too will actually make India-China relations harder. So I would expect that the geopolitical alignments that India has chosen as tensions rose with China over the last decade, those are likely to continue. Close military security intelligence links with the US, working with partners on China's periphery who share India's concerns about China's assertive course, like Japan. But I think, frankly, external balancing, while useful, is limited in its utility as an instrument to change Chinese behavior because of the balance of power, of Chinese economic power in particular. And India will therefore try and buttress those with a more active role in her immediate neighborhood, consolidating relations in the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region. India will also, I think, in my opinion, have to look for new forms of engagement and revised foreign economic trade policies, because India relies on the world now for the commodities, energy, technology, capital, and access to markets that we need for our own transformation. So here again, I think India will increasingly look to partners like Europe. As China-US relations get more confrontational, both China and the US see India-China relations in zero-sum terms. The US obviously has an interest in India seeing China the way she does and acting in the way the US prefers. But the US is primarily interested in contesting China in the maritime domain, which is crucial, the Indo-Pacific, which is crucial to the US ability to project power globally and to her own economic well-being. But the Indo-Pacific strategy effectively concedes continental Eurasia to China and Russia, and especially so after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. India's issues with China are primarily on land, secondarily at sea, at least for the present. India is the only member of the Quad with a land border with China. And that is why it seems to me that the India-US strategic relationship will remain a partnership with several features of alliance. But even if India-China relations continue to worsen, but there won't be a military alliance or a defense alliance. In order to handle her concerns on the Asian continent, India needs to work with Iran, with Russia, both of which, frankly, are being very short-sightedly pushed into Chinese arms by Western US policies at present, forcing them to acquiesce in the consolidation of the Eurasian landmass under Chinese auspices through the BRI, etc. The other external variable which will affect the relationship is China's internal trajectory and politics, which of course is opaque and uncertain for most of us. The signs suggest that it required considerable effort for the Chinese leadership to overcome internal challenges after its initial failures in handling COVID, but subsequently US pressure, nationalist diversions like Hong Kong, etc., helped to solidify elite unity behind the current leadership. Nevertheless, the pandemic and a less favorable international environment, US pushback, have actually turned China inwards and led her to chart what a new course, actually. She herself says so, economically and socially in terms of common prosperity, dual circulation economy, and so on. China's other problem is that once you reveal ambition and nationalism and arouse it, it can't easily be dialed back. And it's much harder to wind back much more assertive diplomacy that she has been practicing in the last few years. So the million-dollar question, of course, is whether the China dream is receding, unattainable, or being realized as a result of what China is doing now, and whether that will determine whether Asia will be China-centered, truly multipolar, or as it is today, between orders. So there's no clear answers to these questions, and that uncertainty actually adds sharpness to India-China tension. So all in all, external balancing by India to counter the effects of Chinese behavior has its limits. And it seems to me that the relationship, India and China's other preoccupations, stakes in the relationship, means that this will be a relationship both of strategic competition and of cooperation. Ideally, it'll be one where each of them goes their own way, leaves the other in peace, respecting their core interests. But if that's where both countries want to go, they're taking a very long and circuitous route to get there and seem to be in no hurry either. So, which makes me worry about the risks of unintended consequences, miscalculation. I actually believe that the Chinese did miscalculate in 2020, which is why we've seen 4 PLA commanders in the Western Theater Command in 1 year. And the fundamental issue remains for India of the gap in comprehensive national power between the two countries, which has grown since the modus vivendi was arrived at in the 80s. At that time, The two countries are roughly the same level of economic development, same levels of technological sophistication, and of integration in the world economy. Since then, of course, China has become a global economic power and a dominant regional military and political power in Northeast and Southeast Asia. India's own security needs have expanded. She's an active participant in the world economy, and her security needs are both continental and maritime. So, and let's see, the key, therefore, to my mind, to India-China relations, the future of India-China, lies not just in the military, the political decisions that Beijing and New Delhi take, but in India's success in transforming herself and her economy. And until India succeeds in doing so, the turbulence in India-China relations will likely continue. I'll stop here, and I'd be very happy to hear what you think, or to hear any comments that you might have to make about this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very comprehensive presentation, which opened a lot of different avenues for questions and comments. Let me perhaps start by one question. You insisted on the structural reason for the deterioration of relations, insisting notably on US-India relationship and their potential, but you said you were speculating on Chinese behavior and so on. You also insisted on the fact there will be no military alliance and that the US, both China and US, saw India in zero-sum terms. Now, in your book, you say, and I quote you, it is also in India's interest to work for an open, inclusive, and plural security order in the Indo-Pacific. Is there still room for this open, inclusive, and plural security order in the Indo-Pacific now?
You know, it's become a mantra that everybody swears allegiance to.
Yes.
You look at the European Indo-Pacific strategy, India says so, the US says so, ASEAN says so, Japan says so. The real question is China and China's attitude, approach to this, because China has actually never quite made clear what sort of security architecture she envisages in Asia. What she's doing is building a new architecture from the bottom up, through the BRI, through connectivity projects, through trade, economy. So for me, the answer to the question is this possible? It depends on China's trajectory. If we end up with a powerful but frustrated China, it's unlikely, because, that's one possibility. If we end up with the Chinese dream realized in all its aspects, including China being center stage in Asia, then it won't necessarily be an open order, because that's not what China has practiced in the past, either traditionally, in history, or in the recent past. So I'm not really sure how to. So for me, it's an open question, but I think it's a desirable goal, one. Two, I think the very effort of trying to get there is worth making, because Asia is not just one security system. It's an agglomeration of several sub-regional, regional systems. I mean, Northeast Asia has its own problems. The Indian Ocean region has its own. The seas near China are very different from the Western Pacific or the Indian Ocean, which is an open ocean, where nobody has ever managed to control all the choke points around it, not even Pax Britannica at its height. So, and therefore it has stayed an open ocean of trade rather than a battle space like the seas near China have been in the past, East China Sea or the South China Sea. So for me, it's worth trying for, even if we're not sure that, yes, it's an attainable goal.
But we all more or less understand intuitively, at least, what powerful but frustrated China is. What is less clear, what is a powerful but not frustrated China?
That I think is, I have a bit in the book where, as I say, many people say, oh, China will go back to historical norm, but everybody has a different version of what that historical norm was. You know, if you ask the Chinese, it was a benign moral order where, yes, there was a hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy based on reality, and it served everybody's interests. So this, they say that today's common destiny, community of common destiny that Xi Jinping uses, is actually a direct sort of descendant of traditional Chinese statecraft. There are others who will tell you, no, this is a tributary system and it didn't work very well. And look at the number of wars in Inner Asia right through the centuries, and that this was a hierarchical, closed system which demanded loyalty, subservience, etc. I don't know. For me, the historical norm is actually of multiverses, which traded, exchanged people, ideas, goods, etc. with each other, between East Asia, the Indian Ocean region, and the Levant, but did not actually interfere in each other's political and security calculus. That's what we were before the 19th century, before globalization under European auspices made us into one world. And today we can't escape that. We are in one economically globalized world. Technology has abolished boundaries, frankly. I mean, you have a belt of weapons of mass destruction all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, from Israel to North Korea. You have the world's greatest arms race going on in Asia for the last 20 years, a little more than 20 years. So we, I think, cannot go back to historical patterns. But how the new pattern will emerge, I'm very nervous of predicting. I really don't know. You know, there's never been Pax Sinica. But we don't know to what extent Chinese culture, strategic culture, has actually been Westphalianized. I don't know. So it gets very hard to predict where we will be, whether, as you said, it's a satisfied and powerful China or a dissatisfied and powerful China. We don't know.
Thank you. Let's turn now to the audience with the first question from Mrs. Gouveia. How do you see AUKUS in the context of India-China relation? Just for those who wouldn't know, AUKUS is the security pact which was just recently signed between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Well, I can see why it would worry the Chinese, because, you know, it would, when the Australians acquire these capabilities of having SSNs, it would call into question China's ability to dominate and to operate freely, even within the first island chain, which today she has managed after about 30 years of real effort. So I can see why it would worry the Chinese. And I can see also its attractiveness to the US and to Australia. And I think there will be several countries in the Indo-Pacific who privately would say, yeah, good. It brings some balance back. The Chinese did a huge naval buildup. Now it tries to restore the strategic balance and the balance of power, actually, especially undersea. So there will be countries who welcome it quietly. I'm not sure that it was done very sensibly without talking to all those who have interests. Certainly, from what I hear, the way that the news was broken to France was not very polite. But apart from this, the strategic implications of SSNs in the hands of Australia or of other powers in the neighborhood, which would try maybe restore some element of military balance. I'm not sure that it will have great political impact or changes the other calculus very much. This is primarily one part of a larger defense architecture, which the US is playing the game with China on what her strengths are, which is military. China is playing the game on her strengths, which are economic, and so she concentrates on those, and that's what, and I see AUKUS as part of that process of the US doing what it needs to in order to keep the maritime domain favorable to itself, as it has been now for 60 years.
Thank you. A question for Vice Admiral Sinha. Considering the bilateral relations between India and China, Pakistan, and counterterrorism being the core of any mini or multilateral cooperation for India, where do you see SCO is headed?
Well, SCO, if you look at its evolution over time, it achieved its first function, boundaries, and solving territorial issues in Central Asia between China and the new stans and Russia fairly quickly. Second goal that it set itself of providing security, dealing with terrorism, counterterrorism, issues like that, it's still working on. And frankly, there, I'm not sure that India-Pakistan differences or India-China differences will make that difficult for SCO, because it seems to me that we all share a common interest in some of those agenda items. The fact is, however, that SCO itself has a very long way to go to be an effective instrument. And I think the real proof of that is nobody is talking about what SCO is going to do now that the US has left Afghanistan, and now that there is uncertainty about the future and about what will come out of Afghanistan, the kinds of extremism, whether there will be support for terrorism in Afghanistan. All this, frankly, so for me, SCO is still a half-developed instrument, which has a long way to go. In any case, India-Pakistan relations, India-China relations are not going to be settled multilaterally in SCO or in any such forum. These are relationships which are fundamental for all of us, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Pakistan, and they have their own drivers and their own momentum, and they are sui generis. They are not driven essentially by multilateral formations or even by the larger geopolitics of it. So I would actually say that SCO itself, good luck to it if it manages to do what it says it wants to do. And I think we should also, we as India, I think it's in India's interest to encourage it to do good work. But I wouldn't bet on the SCO or any such multilateral organization in the Asian context today, because the balance of power is shifting so rapidly and because there are other drivers for the main relationships in the region.
Thank you, Ambassador. A question for Mr. Das. I mean, isn't India exposed by both land and sea? Central Asia, the land border, and the string of pearls around India becoming a choker potentially? Would this not raise the value of a closer partnership or even alliance in the Quad?
Well, the Quad is primarily a collection of maritime powers. And the Quad, so far, it started actually as a discussion of maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Quad hasn't shown much appetite for doing anything on the continental landmass of Asia. And I think you'd have to really stretch your imagination to think of conditions which would tempt the US back onto the continental Asian landmass for any military purpose. Even her political involvement, quite frankly, is very limited today. So so you're quite right. Yes, as I said, India has both continental and maritime concerns, security issues to deal with. The Quad, I think, is a help in dealing with the maritime issues, but I don't think we should look at the Quad for, even if it becomes a much stronger alliance and so on, which I don't expect it to, frankly. I don't see how it is going to address our issues on land. And I don't think we expect it either. If you saw our reactions last year in 2020, when the LAC with China was hot, when there were actually sanguinary clashes on the LAC, we didn't turn to the Quad for support and so this is why I said in my remarks that there is no way around the need for self-strengthening. And for me, that is the only way, that is the core. The rest of it is jam, actually. Whether it's external balancing, whether it's Quad, whether it's other relationships.
A question from Mrs. Anes Svoboda. How can the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan change the balance between China and India?
You know, it's, we've both India and China have, for a very long time actually, followed very different policies in Afghanistan. The Chinese have followed a hedging strategy. They've been in touch with the Taliban, for instance, for a very long time. And they have, because of their defensive interests in Xinjiang particularly, they have shown a willingness to work with anybody in Afghanistan who assures them of preventing Xinjiang Uyghur separatism and so on from finding a base or support in Afghanistan. I mean, they had meetings. They were, I think, the only, apart from the Saudis, Emiratis, and Pakistanis, they were the only diplomats I knew who met with Mullah Omar before 1996. And they have kept those links going. India's approach has always been to work with the established authorities, whoever they may be, and to concentrate on building direct links with the Afghan people, and while avoiding a military footprint and so on. Now, the result has been that India's relationships in Afghanistan have lasted for a long time. But when you look at the state-to-state relationship, it's gone up and down. It's had very extreme variations. Chinese have had a smaller footprint for most of the time, and they've been very cautious, but they have tried to at least preserve their own, to defend themselves from what could come out of Afghanistan. Have they succeeded? Yes and no. There are periods when they have, there are periods when they haven't, because it is a very fluid situation in Afghanistan. Not just now, but it has been fluid for quite some time. And there's always been space for various extremist groups to operate in Afghanistan. We've seen Pakistani groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed find a foothold, or actually being outsourced to Afghanistan by the ISI in Pakistan. The Chinese have worked with whoever they can, whether it's the Pakistanis, whether it's the Taliban themselves or other groups in Afghanistan, to try and prevent Xinjiang being affected by what comes out of Afghanistan. So I don't think that what happens in Afghanistan, the US withdrawal, will actually change the India-China balance. What it will do is, and this is purely hypothetical, what it will do is help to concentrate all our minds on the real dangers of extremism and terrorism actually coming out of Afghanistan. And not just Indian and Chinese minds, but Pakistani minds as well, Iranians, Russians, everybody else in the region, I think, needs to now actually think through how they're going to deal with this new situation. Whether they take the Taliban's assurances seriously, if they do, how do they verify them? What do they make of, what kind of leverage can they create which can lead the Taliban to actually implement what they're promising to do? Let's see. So I'm not sure that it will change the India-China balance, but it will, I think, change our calculus of the region, of the periphery that we both share.
Thank you. There is a question you briefly addressed in your presentation, which is of particular importance for the European, and this is your relation with Russia in the context of the India-China relation. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and say what you really expect from the relationship, eventually what are the limits of this relationship, and how things are likely to unfold? Indian officials often ask their European counterpart to be more open to Russia. The fact is the French president, for example, has tried to open up to them, has been heavily criticized by European counterpart for the same reason, but got absolutely nothing in response from the Russian. And therefore, there is a question as to what is the value of this opening up, or what is the qualitative step that would be necessary in order to change the ongoing dynamic?
I can't tell Europe what it should do, because Europe thinks of its own interests and will decide what to do with Russia based on its own interests and calculus. But what I can do is tell you how it looks to an Indian, what Europe has done so far, and what the effect of Western pressure on Russia has been to make Russia more and more dependent on China. The Russians were reluctant partners with China. But increasingly, the Chinese have used their economic weight, the fact that they are major purchasers of Russia's biggest exports, which is energy and commodities. And China is the biggest market on earth for those things. And also that as the political space for Russia has contracted, thanks to US, European, other pressure, Europe might say, oh, it's all Russia's fault because of what Russia did in Ukraine, etc. Maybe whoever is responsible, the fact is that as their political space has contracted, Russia has chosen to work closer and closer with China. And we have had a very close and significant relationship with Russia, a strategic relationship. Most of our major weapons platforms still Russian. And quite apart from that, we have also worked together on a whole host of other issues. Russia has been an important partner for us right through and remains so in several respects. None of us, I think, especially in today's situation where we are uncertain about what's going to happen in Asia, we're uncertain about China's future trajectory, we don't even know what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I mean, that adds to the uncertainty. In this situation, frankly, each of us is looking for multiple options and is trying to keep these relationships going. And both India and Russia have made a huge commitment to keeping those relationships that we have going, to staying in touch and in building that relationship out. Does it bother us that Russia is getting closer and closer to China? Yes, it does. I'm sure it does. But so far, at least, it has not resulted in directly impacting our relationship with China, unlike in the past. If you go all the way back to the 50s and 60s, where, frankly, when the Soviets had to choose in 62 at the beginning of the war, they chose China and they supported China. So we've had difficult moments before in the relationship. In 1968, Kosygin announced that he was going to sell weapons to Pakistan. But our broader interest in congruence has normally carried that India-Russia relationship through. And right now it looks as though it still will. But I don't think that any country, it doesn't matter whether Russia, India, likes to feel its strategic space being contracted, likes to feel it being pressured into limiting its strategic options. which is what has happened to Russia over the recent past. Some of it because of Western pressure, some of it because of her own demographic decline, because of the nature of her economy and so on. So, and for many of these things, China seems to offer an answer. So I don't expect that relationship to vanish overnight, but I do think that the Russians understand the effects of what they're doing very well. And you will notice there, it's easy to sit outside and think there's complete congruence between China and Russia, but there isn't really. On issues in the Middle East, on issues on Iran, for instance, there are differences in the way they both approach it. And even in Afghanistan, in other issues today, they're not exactly the same. So while I wouldn't say Europe should do this, Europe should do that, I do think that Europe should be aware of the consequences of what it's doing with Russia. Let's see. I think we're still in a moment of flux. I think there's a fair amount of play still in each of these relationships: Russia, China, Russia, India, and Europe as well. Let's see.
Thank you. I'd like to remind everybody that you can still ask your question by going to the Q&A box. I'd like to turn now to the domestic dimension of the India-China relation. You mentioned it in your conclusion. You said this is one factor which in the future will affect the dynamic of the bilateral relation. How do you see that dynamic going? Because in your book, you mentioned that, I'm just reminding that India has improved its situation vis-a-vis every country in the world except China. So how is it so, and what is the current trajectory? Where is it likely to lead India?
Yeah, it's a favorite sort of question in the strategic community. Can India catch up with China? When will India catch up with China? And so on. I think India and China have always been very different, both societies and economies. Historically, the Chinese economy has always been about 1/3 bigger than the Indian economy. But in terms of, in other terms, the balance has really varied. The fact is that until the 19th century, they didn't enter into each other's political or other calculus. And the popular imagination in each country of the other is really, now at least, filled with only the very recent past, which in the Indian case is a story of one betrayal after another. That's the popular narrative. And it's an attractive narrative because it has a beginning, a crescendo, an ending. It ends in war in 1962, but we tried to be friendly in the 1950s. And the same story is being told about Modi and Xi Jinping again today, which is why China is so unpopular. And when you look at all the polls, whether it's Pew or whether the Indian polls that I quoted, which said over 80% of Indians thought that India had been betrayed by China. But the interesting thing is that not in the 1950s, not now. Government policy is not driven purely by public opinion. Governments have been much more careful in trying to manage the relationship and into carrying it forward. So when we say the domestic dimension, and today I don't think you have the same kind of very strong feelings in India as you had in the late 1950s when the Dalai Lama came to India in 1959, when we had Tibetan refugees pouring across the border, when Tibet was in flames and in revolt actually against Chinese rule. So you don't have that kind of situation today. Instead, today we have, as I said, a flourishing economic relationship, which is actually growing despite all this. So when I speak at various venues around the country, and I don't see the kinds of responses on China from the audience that I see about, say, Pakistan, where there are much stronger feelings in the popular mind. So for me, the domestic, at least public opinion, is not necessarily going to drive India-China relations in either a negative or a positive, certainly not in a positive direction, but or in a negative direction today. But there is always the risk of India-China relations becoming a political football at home. That is what happened in 59-62, where it becomes a stick to oppose the government or to fight political battles domestically. So far, that has not happened either in 2020, 2021. This is not the issue. There are other bigger issues, the economy, COVID, etc. So in a sense, today, the domestic dimensions of India-China relations, in India at least, I find are not as significant as they could have been. And that's why I don't think that the slide into conflict that I spoke about between 59 and 62 is a likely scenario today. In China, it's much harder to tell because, you know, even the internet is censored, and it's much harder to tell what sort of, and views can be tailored and promoted. But there is, I think, in China, there is a lack of, certainly, of knowledge about India, but also of understanding of India. But that's equally true in India. And I think one thing we really need to do is to concentrate on building up China studies in India. But that's a long-term, slow process. But as I was saying when I was talking, for me, the determinant, therefore, is not public opinion as our success in transforming India and in developing India. And that's what's going to make the real difference.
Thank you. We have what will be perhaps the last question from Mr. Denis Verret, I suppose from France. Do you see any possible impact of the AUKUS agreement on the France-India relation?
I saw an article today saying that as a result, France-India relations will get much better. I don't know. I thought France-India relations were going to get better anyway. There's enough reasons. It has a solid background. We have enough things to do together. We agree on so many things. So I don't think we need AUKUS to make it better. But at least that seems to be the opinion out there among people who think about these issues.
Just to complement the question, perhaps, do you see any potential impact on India-Australia relationship?
Not really, no. Not directly, no. But, you know, frankly, this is, as I see it, this is something between Australia and the US, and it's up to them to do what they want. But they could have done it in a better way without the eruptions in their relationship with France, with other people. But I don't see this substituting for anything else or somehow diminishing other things. It's a fact of life that we will have to live with when they have the SSNs, which is going to be a long time away. So it's something we'll have to factor into our planning.
The question was not so much about, you know, the France-Australia relationship and the potential impact on France-India relation. It was more about the fact that, as you yourself said in your presentation, this signals a polarization which keeps growing and growing and growing. And India has been one of the countries reluctant to fall in that trap for a long time, and to a large extent still is. And that was the intention behind the question.
Yeah, but I think, you know, it's a fact. I mean, China-US relations are getting worse. And now the Chinese are practicing linkage between climate change and the rest of the relationship. The US itself still has to finalize its policy on Chinese technology companies, for instance. But clearly the trend is towards more strategic competition between them. And I see AUKUS as part of that process, as just one more element in China-US strategic competition and rivalry. And the US is doing what it's good at. which is military, naval, the maritime domain, which is so important to her, and she will do that. So, we might not like polarization, but it's a fact. And I think we have to deal with it. So I see AUKUS as, in that sense, I see it as only one more. But I do see AUKUS as playing a useful role in restoring some maritime balance, because it creates a capability which is different from what has existed so far. And it doesn't leave the entire burden of the balance entirely on the US.
One very last question from Mr. Nicholas McLean. There is an active and influential Indian community in Hong Kong. How much is Indian public opinion influenced by the shift in Hong Kong from the rule of law? Also, our engaged in Indian public opinion in Taiwan issue.
Taiwan has become a much, much bigger part of the Indian public discourse on China. And but Hong Kong, surprisingly, I was a bit surprised. But then, most of it happened at a time when we had other preoccupations at home. And I suppose that, somehow Hong Kong itself was already in transition. And it was seen largely, I think, as being merely an accelerated transition to something that any case was going to happen. But Taiwan actually, and talk of a Taiwan card, a Taiwan option, of the need to develop relations with Taiwan, that has gone up tremendously in the last few years in India. And Taiwan is a fairly significant trading partner, and especially for technology companies and so on. We have an office in Taiwan, which performs all the functions of an embassy. We have, flights, all the commercial links, etc., avoidance of double taxation. We do most things that we do with other countries with Taiwan. So, and that relationship, I think, will keep growing, because there's obvious economic interest and complementarity. But let's see where it goes. And Taiwan, frankly, presents itself in India as the alternative China, and as somehow the benign China. So that relationship will keep growing. India is one of the few countries who used to only deal with PRC, but has slowly over time expanded her relationship with Taiwan, and has actually managed to do both. And it's one thing that has not figured in Chinese complaints to India. Maybe it will now, but let's see.
Well, Ambassador Menon, thank you very much for your time to start with, but also the depth of your answers to our question. I'm sure that we all had a very interesting time listening to you, and it's been very, very enlightening. I'd like now to bring, unfortunately, this session to a close. We could have stayed with you much longer. I would just like to remind our audience that this webinar series is meant to happen once a month, and we'll have the pleasure to receive next former Foreign Secretary DJ Gokhale, still on the China question, and we'll continue this way. Ambassador Menon, thank you very, very much. It's been a real pleasure, and we hope to see you soon on this very website for another kind of event. But still, thank you again for today, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed it, and thank you all of you for your attention.